Welcome to episode 3 of the C-Suite Cyber Podcast. The C-Suite Cyber Podcast enables C-Suite executives to make security-informed decisions.
Yeah. So, welcome. What are we talking about today before we get into other stuff?
Today, we've got a big one. We're talking about vulnerabilities.
Exploits.
Yep. They go hand in hand.
They do. We should probably explain that at some point what the difference is. It's like a security plus essential and probably a CISP, like essential. What are these things? So before we get going into all that, let's go ahead and do our sponsor break. This episode was brought to you by Tandem Cyber Solutions, your go-to penetration testing partner. One of the things that is different about how they work is that they like to be a true partner in the sense that they're there for you all year round with their hacker-powered security program. And what that means is basically you make changes on the network next week after you do a pen test, and which means the state of your network, the state of the security has changed. You can call them up and say, hey, can you check this out and tell me what you would do differently if you would reconfigure this or whatever? And that's simply so you're not stuck with that vulnerability until next year's penetration test comes around and you have that whole year for the hackers to hit you up and find that vulnerability. So yeah, for more conversation with Tandem Cyber Solutions, check out their website at tandemcybersolutions.com/C-Suite Cyber. Let them know that we sent you there and have a chat about how they can help you and help improve your security program. All right. Let's get into it.
All right. So first thing we should probably cover is what is a vulnerability? I personally am a big fan of I don't know if it's a hyperbole or whatever. I'm not a lit major.
Hyperbole. Big words today. Big words on a Wednesday. Thanks.
So there's an example of how to demonstrate this using getting punched in the face, right? So if you're a threat actor, you're the person who wants to punch me in the face. The threat would be the punch, right? The vulnerability is my lack of ability to defend or deflect that punch. And then the risk would be the likelihood of getting punched. And then the exploit here would be the fist, right? So putting that all together, basically you have a vulnerability, it introduces risk to your organization. And then the exploit would be actually taking action against that vulnerability to perform malicious actions or steal data, whatever that might be.
Yeah, exploits usually talk in terms of like, say, what's a funny like defensive move? The Rhino block. You ever hear of that? So like someone puts their elbow up to try to block. I mean, it's just like super like memey defense, but you just like throw a punch, like maybe a hook that goes around the Rhino block because it's around the side, or like a boxer. They're standing there weaving, or they have their hands up to block shots to their face, and so instead you do a hook or you come around to the side. That would be the exploit. You found their weakness. You're taking advantage of that weakness. So it's a great. Would you call it hyperbole? Metaphor?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the right word. Metaphor might be better.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what a hyperbole is. Yeah, comment on his poor use of vocabulary or my lack of understanding.
We'll help you with cyber stuff. We don't read. Well, you read.
We're not learned individuals.
Yeah. All right. So now we've got that vulnerability piece out of the way. Let's, do you want to start with some of the examples, or do you want to discuss like how you might come across a vulnerability in your organization, or I guess be notified that there's a vulnerability? Where should we take it today?
Yeah, I guess let's start with how you identify vulnerabilities, I think is good. And then we'll talk about exploits and how they impact that specific vulnerability in a real world setting. So I guess I'll let you start. Like, how would someone find all well, you can never find all the vulnerabilities, just to state that first. But how would someone go about looking for vulnerabilities? What are some tools that organizations have?
Yeah, so typically vulnerability scanning or vulnerability management is going to be a critical piece of your security posture, regardless of, the level of organization that you are, right? Whether it's your MSP, MSSP, SSP, or yourself actually doing it. So there's several different tools. You have paid scanners, free scanners. So you've got Qualys, Nuclei. I'm sure there's way more that I did not look up today.
Nessus, that's my go-to.
Nessus is a great one.
You're welcome, Nessus. We'll call you out.
Yeah, plugged you in there.
Yeah, Rapid7 has one.
So typically, you're going to have some scanning cycle that'll be followed up by patch management, right? Getting the patches from the vendors, deploying the patches, making sure that everything is up to date, driving those vulnerable system numbers down. And then that's going to be an everlasting process, right? Like there's always going to be vulnerabilities. Just like you mentioned, you're never going to detect all of the vulnerabilities. Someone will find a way to get in, an IDOR, a 0-day, something will be found and exploited at some point in time. But you need to scan or have some type of scanning implemented.
Yeah, it's a really, really key piece of a strong cybersecurity program. But let's back up for a second and talk about what patching is, because I think some people, like, we use that word pretty nonchalantly, but people may not know what that is. So a patch is really just like a software update, or maybe even just like a fix. So you've probably looked at release notes for different software, and if you look in there, it'll say, hey, there's a patch for this specific bug or this vulnerability. And that's what we're talking about with patching here, is that you have an update or you have some sort of software package that's going to fix something that's wrong with wherever the vulnerability is. So when you're scanning, it says, hey, there's this vulnerability. And typically what these scanners do is they'll tell you what the fix is. So it'll say like, get with your vendor for an update, or this specific update, any version after this is no longer affected. So that's what we're talking about with patching. And so patch management is the process that you go through for patching systematically more than anything, right? A lot of times we want to see, for a healthy program, a cyclical approach to patching where you're saying, okay, we're going to do a scan every month or every quarter, and then we're going to create tickets for all these findings for every host or endpoint that's affected by these vulnerabilities. And we're going to make sure we're pushing out those patches like your IT people would be potentially pushing out those patches, or your network people if it's a network appliance that's affected. And so that's what we're talking about. And then when you get to larger organizations, patch management means a little bit different. So with larger organizations, you're patching smaller subsets at a time, because sometimes patches do break things. And so what they're doing is they're testing a small subset looking for issues before they roll it out across the entire enterprise. And what that does is, instead of blasting everything in your enterprise with one shot and killing it, you're just doing a small subset, maybe destroying that, but saying, okay, we have minimal impact now instead of major impact. Let's roll those patches back and wait and notify the vendor that something's wrong with this patch.
I believe there was a recent example where that did not occur, that might have originated from an EDR vendor and cost billions of dollars in business, right?
Well, so it's funny with that. And I was like, oh, patch management was what I was talking about on social media. And that wasn't the case. So I talked to my buddy, Sean, call it the Sean. He's a beast. He's like my go-to guy for anything related to like architecture. I told you about him. He's like the assassin. He goes in and rebuilds people's organizations from the ground up if they get hit with ransomware or something. He's an animal. But anyways, he was talking about it and he ran into that some. And basically, he was saying you had no choice but to patch. You couldn't stop it. CrowdStrike automatically did that update. And so there was nothing you could have done. Anyone with a good patch management system wouldn't have mattered. There's nothing you could have done to prevent that catastrophe. All you could have done was do all the fixes. It's insane. But I was like, oh, just slowly roll out patches. Nope. Would not have helped at all. You were at the mercy of whatever that was.
To be clear, I mean, they should have performed some testing and regression testing instead of pushing out the channel file that cannot be stopped on the customer's end. And I'm sure they did some extent of testing, right? But obviously it was widespread enough that impacted businesses across the world. And also very easy to identify who's using that platform now.
Yeah, we were talking about, like, I guess I know who's using CrowdStrike now, and I could, if I was a bad guy, I'd be able to develop my exploits and target them specifically because I know what they're using. But yeah, what AJ's talking about, it's more that's into like software development, the software development lifecycle. What is that? What's DevOps? There's like all these other buzzwords for, but it's a little bit different than patch management. That's like the precursor, because this is all the crap the developer should be doing before they release any patch, more than anything. Yeah. So that's one of the things that would be completely out of your hand as a CISO or organization, but except for choosing vendors wisely. That's in your hands.
Yeah. And an example that everyone is probably familiar with as far as patching coming into their organization, right? If you use Windows, you've probably heard of Patch Tuesday, where Microsoft releases a collection of patches. Is that monthly?
Exploit Thursday, Patch Tuesday. Yeah, man.
Yeah. And so sometimes organizations will kind of have a collection of patches and then they'll ship them out, or it could be based on the criticality, right? So if something is deemed as a critical, then it needs to get patched right away. Maybe there's active exploitation being observed in the wild, meaning out in the interwebs. And so they want to get that pushed out to as many customers as they can before the number of victims grows or the number of people being exploited grows.
Those are considered, I think they say, out of cycle patching. Instead of, I don't remember what the date is they released. I actually had that asked in an interview. I'm like, I don't know. I just hack stuff, man. Like, I don't really care.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they usually do it once a month. Unless there's something just insane, and then they'll do something in the middle of the month or right after. It just depends. But yeah, if it's like, so there's this whole rating system with vulnerabilities too. I guess at some point we'll talk about it. We didn't have it in our notes. So we've been trying to be more business-like and write notes for things so we don't miss stuff. But there is like a rating from 0 to 10, 10 being the most critical for a vulnerability. And then in there you have like a low, a medium, a high, and critical. So stuff that's maybe critical will probably be patched as soon as they can figure out how to fix the issue. There's usually no time. It just depends on where the problem lies with the software. It could be something that's just insane and they're going to have to do a lot of work to fix it. And if that's the case, it may take a while. But if it's something silly, like they forgot parentheses or forgot to put something in quotes, I'm pretty quick and they'll ship it out, which happens sometimes too.
Yeah. So if you are trying to find versioning, we'll say in your organization, you know that you're running the application that a recent vulnerability came out for. And this is something that I think organizations of all sizes are going to struggle with. How can they determine if they have a vulnerable version versus using a scanner like, say, Qualys, for example, which might just detect that the application exists before they have a better QID is what Qualys calls it, where they're actually able to pick up on the specific version?
Yeah, so I would say for most things, you'll be able to pick up the version. And that's typically done where the scanner will do some sort of connection. So for instance, like SSH, it may attempt to connect and it'll usually have, we call it a banner. It'll say, hey, I'm version whatever. And then it'll take that information and provide it to the user. So like, okay, I know this is this version and it's affected by all these vulnerabilities. That's the easiest way. And I think the one I typically use has that for most. Other ways, it could be you actually have to look at the software. So we were talking about something before the show, and one we'll talk about too, Log4j, where it may not be as obvious what the version is, and because it's a library, a dependency of the code itself, and you may have to go in there and look what dependency is actually pulled and installed here. I would say that's more of the rare case because most things have some sort of maintenance where you can see what version it's on, some sort of README or something that lets you know what version it's on. And that's typically what I'll look at too as an attacker. I might look for a README to see what version something is so I can look up an exploit for it. So that's another way. And then you have tools in the enterprise that I know some AV, enterprise level AV can do it where you can look across the entire network and see which versions of different software are running. So that's another way, which goes into one of the things most organizations should be doing, which is software and device, like keeping track of them, like logging and maintaining list of these devices. What's the proper word here? I don't know why my brain's not working. It worked hard today, I guess.
Like asset management or software?
Asset management. There you go. That's the buzzword I was looking for. Yeah. Asset management, which is like device and software. You should know what you have in your environment or have something collecting that data for you so that when a big critical vulnerability comes out and you're like, hey, I have that thing. Am I affected? You can go in there and be like, okay, we have 50 devices that are affected by this. We need to either isolate or patch.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another huge reason huge reason why you should be managing that stuff well.
Yeah, and that's one thing larger organizations definitely have issues with, as far as like having a single record of truth, or you're always adding new instances or removing instances, and then people have local administrator rights, so they're able to install software that you might not have accounted for. So one thing that you could try as well, if you have an IT team or you have someone who has basic scripting abilities or access to an LLM like ChatGPT, you could also query like registry files to see. A lot of times the installed programs have their own registry hives, and then they'll have versioning information there, or some simple PowerShell scripting will probably get you an answer most times too. Depending on the level of access to tooling that you have, you could send that out to all your devices and then get that information, present it in like a CSV type of format or whatever. So there are ways. It's really, do you know what is possible, and do you have good practices already, such as maintaining an asset management list or software approval list, right? Where you're able to rely on that data and it's not out of date or just completely incorrect.
Yeah, it's tough. And another good reason, I think we've talked about this on one of the other episodes, where you should know your tools. If you are a fairly mature organization, you likely have a tool that can pull that information for you, whatever it is. So you may be able to do it with a GPO by running a script on everything and pulling it back. This also is why you should have a wizard somewhere in your organization that can just build stuff and solve problems for you. That is like the lifesaver of most organizations, just that guy, that go-to guy. I know I've played that role a few times, but you just have to have someone that can think outside the box. Okay, they're not going to give me 20 grand for a tool. How do I solve this problem for free? Yeah, but yeah, there's typically a way to find it, and it's good to identify that. And I would say that is probably one of the findings that you're going to have in an after action review if you're not doing it when you actually. I'm going to say when, because it is likely, but if you were to have a breach, that's one of the things that's probably going to come out of it, is if we would have known what software was on these systems and that we had out-of-date stuff, we could have fixed it before it was taken advantage of.
Cool. You ready for some examples?
Yeah, what was the other thing? We talked about finding stuff. We talked about what it was. I thought there was something else we were going to talk about. Yeah, sure. Let's do examples. I'm sure something will come up.
Checking the list here.
The first one is going to be his favorite. I don't know. I'm just making that up. I'm putting him on the spot. We'll see what he comes up with, and then I'll just say that's his favorite.
Not my favorite. I was actually trying to find the one that I worked on when I was at the company, when I had my hiatus, because I did work on one for a security vendor who we won't give publicity to because they laid me off. But basically, we were the team that was responsible for providing
downsizing people. He's very good at what he does. Downsizing. Facebook and Google do that all the time.
Yeah, I worked for a vendor. They had the capability to read files on your system, as well as like query a bunch of things at once. That'll probably give it away. And I want to say it was Print Nightmare or something, but it was basically like, hey, this just came out. Figure out how to get something to our customers by the end of the night, so they're able to see if they're vulnerable, what it might look like if they are impacted, like what are some artifacts that they could look for, blah, blah, blah. And that was so much fun. I think that was there was only two. I don't think Log4j came out when I was on that team, but there were like two back to back. I want to say it was Print Nightmare, but
There's a lot of major ones last year. Or no, 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I know 2021 had a bunch.
Yeah. Was that SolarWinds? I don't know. We should have put dates beside these.
Well, just click the link, man. I try to give you information.
Yeah. So AJ put a list of these together. I was like, hey, we should probably do some exploits. I was like, we should probably have a list before we go into the show. So we put all this together, and I looked through about half of them before we started recording. And then I was complaining about the links he put in here. Like, there's not enough here for me to understand how it works, man. He was like, they don't care. I was like, but I care.
Yeah.
I have to remember. It's been years.
SolarWinds was 2020. Okay. Which is funny because this link was published in 2023. Anyways, okay.
So oldie but goodie, man. SolarWinds is one of my faves.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and start with SolarWinds. You've brought it up in other episodes before. I think most people will have at least heard of the SolarWinds breach and the extent that the threat actors, I believe was it 28, 29? It was one of those, right?
It was allegedly Russia. That's all I remember.
It
They
was
were
them.
very clever. I will give them props.
They were, yeah. So let's go ahead and talk about that one.
Okay. What do you know about it? So also, I want to add that not all of these are necessary vulnerabilities, because SolarWinds wasn't a traditional vulnerability. Like, it was out of date. It was backdoored. So that's not really a vulnerability. You have like malware being embedded into your organization. But these are just, some of them are exploits, but some of these are vulnerabilities or just fun things too. So I just want to put that out there so that people are like, y'all are idiots. This isn't an exploit. Okay, yes, we know.
I mean, we are idiots, but we're still giving out good information.
I guess I could talk a little about SolarWinds. So I actually was one of the big investigators for this at an organization I worked at when it came out. And so I instantly became a subject matter expert on this overnight so that I could help identify like anything with this in there and what the impact was across the organization. Yeah, so basically what happened was there were several versions of SolarWinds, a specific product by SolarWinds, that is. Do you remember which one it was? It wasn't LEM. That's their SIM. It was something else.
I thought it was the thing that tells you like if the servers are alive or not. I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I forgot the name of it though. They have a bunch of products. But basically what they did was during the compile time, or basically so there's different types of software. You have some compiled and some more like scripted-ish, but theirs are compiled. And while it was being compiled, it injected malicious code into it before all the updates were shipped to the users and the organizations who purchased their product. And so basically, when you were getting that patch that we spent like 10 minutes talking about, you were actually getting a piece of malware into your organization, which was absolutely incredible. Because when they looked at the actual code itself before they compiled it, so you usually have the raw code, you didn't see the malware. It was done as it was being compiled and packaged up and ready to go, which was incredible. But the fun thing about it was that it was in a language called C#, so you could decompile it and see the malicious code after the fact. So that was cool. But yeah, basically, I think there were 3 or 4 versions of it that had the malware. So it started, I believe, in October or November of one year, where they had been infiltrated and malicious code found its way in the update. And then it lasted all the way through to like maybe April or June the next year. So there's several versions of it. And essentially what happened, once it was in there, the software would sit for like a week, or the malware. So the malicious code would sit for a week and wait. And then it would reach out to one of the domains controlled by the attacker and then check in. And what would occur, it would say, basically, do you want me to do anything? And they had a list of organizations, essentially, that they wanted to attack and do hands-on keyboard type activities and progress the attack. Otherwise, it would just say, shut down, we don't care. And so that's what it would do. And so you could see there were groups of these call-outs. I'm going super technical. I'm sorry, but it's very fun. It's a very fun attack. But there was groups of these DNS requests, because you could see it in the DNS requests of the domain, or the DGA, domain, what is it? Domain generation algorithms. What does it stand for?
Yeah,
DGA is an acronym. Okay. So there were all these things, but you could reverse it. And in that subdomain, you could see what the actual true domain of the victim was. So these people were sending out all these domain requests, and you could see which people were actually the victims based on the domain. So it was very cool. And I was like digging through all those DGAs to see if the people I was working for, our clients, happened to be victims. So that was a lot of fun.
So if you would have just clicked on the link that I sent, they gained access to SolarWinds September of 2019. They tested their injection into the Orion product.
Orion, that was it.
In
SolarWinds
October.
Orion, yeah.
And then February 2020 is when they started loading Sunburst. And then March.
I was pretty dang close off of memory, and that was like a long time ago.
Yeah. You're good. So the numbers, obviously, it's been several years. Says it impacted 30,000 plus organizations, which is a ton of data.
Some really big ones, some government ones, some massive organizations. A lot of people were affected, and I don't know if they really ever figured out what exactly they were going for. I mean, Russia has a lot of a variety of things they're looking for. It's not like China. When they go after stuff, they're usually looking for intellectual property. That's not necessarily Russia's thing. So I don't know. Does that thing say what kind of the goal was of the campaign?
No, it actually says the purpose of the hack remains largely unknown.
Yeah, because they're so random. If you look at the affected ones, it's like what pulls them together. I have no clue.
Well, they use the product, but I think
besides that,
I mean, it says Russian espionage, most likely foreign intelligence, so probably GRU, unless I'm getting that acronym completely wrong. But
like the minions, isn't that?
yeah, exactly. I can't remember who the other one is. Anyways, doesn't matter. Allegedly Russian, they are the ones who made Sunburst. But with going back to the purpose, right? What was the main reason this hack occurred? Like you were saying, China is typically after intellectual property. Russia is usually politically driven, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the cybercrime out of Russia, which is obviously just money. A lot of ransomware gangs out of there, but typically
dollars.
The Foreign Intelligence Service and the other one, 28, 29. Those are the groups. They're the ones who hacked the Democratic Party a few years ago. They're after information that could position Russia better or let them know ahead of time if there's something coming their way, right? And it's a very weird relationship that we have with Russia. During the wars overseas, right? We had a shadow war where we're like, hey, are you guys in this area? Nope. Okay. And then we'll go bomb it. Or they'll tell us hey, we're about to move into this area. So we'll pull our troops out. So it's very weird. Basically just two people with big sticks yelling at each other and hoping that the other person doesn't hit them with the stick first.
Which reminds me to say, these are our opinions and not of those our employers. These are completely our opinions, so we may talk some crap, and that's us.
Yeah,
it's not their opinion. They have zero opinion on anything that we say.
That is very true.
Don't blame them for it. Just don't put it on them.
Yeah, and 28, 29, 28 is my favorite. Fancy Bear, they're very...
Yeah, you like Russian people.
Yeah, I mean, they're good at what they do, right? In the past... Well, no, because if you think about it, right, you already brought up China. So in the past, China was very loud in their operations. They didn't care if they got caught, right? Russia is very more covert, as identified in this example here. And I like
they have this whole weird underground scene over there for cybercrime in general. It's just bizarre.
Anyways.
SolarWinds.
It happened. A lot of people got impacted. This is interesting. I didn't know this part. So with WannaCry, there was a kill switch, right? WannaCry was this huge...
the domain. You put the domain up, kills it. Yeah.
So
Marcus Hutchins.
Yep.
Who got in trouble for some other stuff.
Yes. But I did not know SolarWinds had a kill switch. According to this, SolarWinds had a kill switch, but once they put the switch in place, the companies were still getting hacked. So I don't know, maybe it was programmed wrong or what?
I believe it was programmed wrong in general, because if you looked at the code, it was supposed to sleep for a set period of time, but based on my investigations, it was triggering the C2 connection way earlier than it was supposed to. So I don't know what was going on with that.
Interesting. I wonder if it has to do with the compilation time of when it landed on the box and then it thought that its time had already started or something. I don't know,
it could be. I didn't do deep, even though I was a malware analyst at the time. It wasn't my job to analyze that sample. My job was to find how bad we were screwed at the time.
That's fair.
Different responsibility.
Yeah. Do you know what the average dwell time was for the SolarWinds attack?
It was probably under a week. It was supposed to be over 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, though.
Wait, let me see if this is okay. Sorry, this is not
Because I
specific
remember
to
seeing stuff with
SolarWinds.
like several days. It wasn't even up to a week.
Yeah, so I thought this was specific to SolarWinds because it's in this article, but actually they just took something from CrowdStrike and threw it in here. So never mind. The average dwell time in the year 2019 was 95 days, which is a long time.
Well, it used to be 6 months or so before like that an attacker dwells in an organization. That used to be the big line for managed detection and response businesses. Hey, you need a professional because you don't know if a hacker's in there. They usually sit there for 6 months before they're found or before they make a move, which is absolutely true. I mean, I've seen it firsthand.
All right.
SolarWinds. It was a fun one. So you can skip through all the technical stuff I said, but it was a really cool one. That was probably one of my most favorite ones that I've worked. Some of the other ones we'll talk about, like I use on a regular basis still, but this was probably my most fun to investigate because it was just absolutely clever. And even like some of the malware itself, usually like when malware executes, it's looking for certain processes running or certain software being installed. So it knows, hey, shouldn't run because whatever this EDR vendor is in here and I don't have a bypass or an attack that works for it. And it did that, but it did it in a unique way. And I don't know if it was the first time it was done, but it was unique. Basically, it had a hash of all the names, the file names that it was looking for. And so it would scan and compare that hash to the list of hashes it had. That's how it looked. So it never looked for that specific thing. Instead, it just looked for the hash of the name of the thing, which was a clever way of doing it. So you can't, like we call it string detection. You can't look through the file and be like, oh, it's looking for all these things. No, it's looking for the hash. And so it's one less thing for your AV products, EDR products to pick up on. Yeah, so it's pretty clever.
Yeah, and that's a fairly common technique now, right? When you're using shellcode or something to not call the actual function that you're looking for, but to call use the hash of it. Yeah, it's good stuff. All right, moving on.
Are you going to move it on to MoveIt?
Yep. Way to
Okay.
take my thunder away, dude. Jeez.
Oh, damn. All right, try it again, man. Try it again.
Nope, over it. All right. So a MoveIt vulnerability happened in, I think it was also 2019. Wait, no. All right. This article, again, was written in 2023. Anyways, Clop ransomware. MoveIt was a product that, sometimes you have vendors that you need to ship data to. It's too large for email, or you're not going to set up like a SharePoint access for them or something, right? So you use a third-party tool similar to MoveIt to basically ship logs or ship contracts, et cetera, et cetera. This was a big product that was used by different levels of government, as well as some universities and such. And Clop, they are the ransomware group. They are the ones that actually exploited this, and then they were able to gain remote code execution. So if I look at my little notes real quick, yeah, so it was actually SQL injection against the application, which gave them remote code execution. And then from there, they were able to compromise the server and then move and actually deploy their ransomware. So pretty nice way to do it. And then with double extortion, right, they're able to read all the files that are actually being stored in the application and such once they gained code execution. So you exfil the data, you ransom the data, and you still hit them with ransomware. So you're ransoming the actual decryption keys. And if they don't pay, now you've got all their juicy data that you can sell on the black market or dark web, or sell it to other agencies, depending on, what data you actually have.
Yeah. So you need to go back now and explain all those fancy words you used.
What words?
RCE. What's RCE?
RCE. Glad you brought that up. RCE stands for remote code execution.
What's that mean?
Basically, Mike has compromised my application using SQL injection. I don't know what the S stands for.
And that's the other thing you have to.
Yep. Let me find what
you have to define too. What is SQL injection? What's SQLI?
Standard. Wait. Structured query language. So it's used in a bunch of different applications and stuff. You might have heard of it if you've used Snowflake or some other MySQL, SQLite, I think.
Oracle, SQLite, yeah, lots of databases out there.
Lots of databases. So basically, that's a language that you can use. And there was a SQL injection, which is a vulnerability that I have never exploited, where you can basically pass something in the code, and if it's not sanitized properly, you can basically gain access to something that you shouldn't be able to. And Mike, you probably have a better explanation of SQL injection there.
Yeah, I actually hated learning SQL injection. I hate databases. I hate it with a passion. But yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you said. Essentially, how it presents itself a lot of times, you have code on a website that is doing queries into a database. And for whatever reason, they're not sanitizing it, like you say, which means you're preventing the user from doing arbitrary commands to the database. And so when you don't do that, when you're not protecting that's coming from the web application to the database, an attacker may be able to take advantage or run their own queries. Now, that doesn't really sound that bad, but there's a lot of power you have by just being able to query databases. And in a lot of cases, not all the times, it can lead to getting control of the underlying system itself where the database sits, which I've done on several different occasions during pen tests. So yeah, SQL injections can be very powerful, but not only that, typically whatever account is running those queries, you have that access if you can run whatever kind of command you want, which means you have access to all the data that that thing has access to. So if you're somewhere, say, a lot of times we see it not a lot of times, classically, we see it presented in the username password fields in a logon prompt. And so you'll see it injected into like the username. 1 equals 1, you're just saying, or it's true. And then it allows you to just log right in without anything. But you can go further by soliciting all the usernames and passwords or all the user information from the database, because you're instead of querying it to see if that username matches with that password you're submitting to something in the database, you're saying, give me everything in that database. I want all the things from that user. So it's a very interesting thing, very powerful. So like you were saying with the double extortion, now I can just extract all that data and sell it. Or say, I'm going to release it to the internet if you don't pay me, which was, I think, the case with this one where, like you said, it was a SQLI. And I want to say it was an internet-facing application where it was just sitting there. It had this vulnerability, and they hit it, attacked it, and they were also able to, like you say, get RCE. So they ended up getting control of the underlying system with the database was on, which allowed them to access other stuff inside the network as well.
Yep. And I don't remember exactly when this occurred, but according to this article on Varonis, they waited for like Memorial Day weekend in the US before they exploited it. So you think a federal holiday, most people are going to be off, and then the attack probably won't be discovered until they come back that following after that following weekend. And then even then, if it's something that isn't signatured, or they don't have like some Mandiant or someone else like actively in their systems looking for a breach, it'll probably not be detected, right? Because this wasn't known at the time. This was a 0-day when it was exploited.
So what's signatured mean? I'm trying to get in a better habit of us defining all these words. We just throw it around willy-nilly, like, everyone knows this stuff, but that's not the case. I got that feedback from some people that have listened.
Yeah, so signatured would be, I think the easiest way to picture it would be antivirus, right? Typically, the way antivirus products work is they rely on signatures, meaning they've seen something before. They are looking for a very particular string or a hash if it's a binary, which is a compiled file. Before Mike asked me, so they're looking for something very specific that is relevant to what they're attempting to detect. And if that string, it's also pretty low to evade, right? Because you can change, if they're looking for a name, you change the name, boom, you're by. If it's a hash, you change a single byte and then the hash is changed, right? So it's a very low item on the pyramid of pain, but several years ago, it was like AV was like the way to go, right? Like that was the way you caught stuff. So that's what I mean by signature. Whereas something that is like dynamic, for example, might take in several pieces of information and determine that something is malicious based off of that, rather than looking for a single instance or even two instances of particular data that is already known.
I'd like to add too, it doesn't just go down to like strings or things in the files. Now I would say because of how they're looking at malware samples now in systems with sandboxes, small virtual systems running, executing, it also comes down to behaviors as well. If there's like specific behaviors they're keying into, I would also classify that as a signature. And to define another term you use, pyramid of pain. So that's something I think you've said a couple of times before. And basically what it is if you remember way back in the day, for people in the US anyways, you had the pyramid of the food groups and stuff. And we have that same concept in cybersecurity, where on the lower end of the pyramid, it's stuff that is more easily modified by the attacker. And so if you're detecting on that, it's not causing a lot of pain. That's why we call it the pyramid of pain. The higher you go up, the more pain it's going to cause and more difficult it is for the attacker to change. And it's going to cause them to invest a lot more time into updating the attack or the malware or whatever it happens to be in order to evade the detection. So like he said, a signature, like a hash, a file hash, would be really low on that, because all it takes is a single zero on a file to completely have a cascading effect on that hash. So it's very low. They don't have to do anything. Add a zero, you have a completely new file, nothing changes, everything else works. But now if you're detecting like strings in the file, that may be slightly higher, but all they have to do is go in there and change that. Or next, maybe a signature with a certificate signing the file. That may be much more difficult, getting a valid signature. So just a concept anyways, the more difficult it is to change for the attacker, the better it is for a blue teamer or an investigator or malware analyst, whatever it is, a vendor, AV vendor or security vendor, the better it is for them to key in on, because it's going to stay that way longer, because it's going to take them more time to fix it.
Yep. So I pulled up the pyramid of pain just so we can cover this for people who are listening. At the
Good
bottom,
idea.
we have hash values. Next, we have IP addresses, right? So it's fairly easy to register a new IP address. Next, above that, we have domain names. Obviously, it costs money to register a domain. Then hopefully it needs to be aged in order for your organization to accept it. Above that, we have network and host artifacts, typically known as IOCs, or indicators of compromise, indicators of activity. I prefer IOAs because just because you see it doesn't mean that you've been compromised. And then we have tools, right? So their tooling is where it starts to get challenging for them. An example of this, very poor example, Mimikatz. Heavily
Mimi kittens,
yeah,
Mimi cats.
heavily signatured file. Even the name, the banner that is used within there will typically be enough to set off a security product, whether it's an EDR or AV, whatever. And then their actual TTPs, which are the tactics, techniques, and procedures. Basically, what activities are they doing? How are they doing them? That is at the top of the pyramid of pain.
What's funny is when you start getting more involved in like the IR space and the threat intel space, you start seeing that a lot of these threat actors do almost they have a playbook, and they run that playbook every time they go into an organization. And that's why threat intel is so good. And when you talk to, like, say you want a pen test, you're like, okay, I'm really more concerned about the people that may be targeting me. Okay, we can look that up and say, okay, who's targeting you? Clop may be targeting you, or whoever it is. Okay, what are they doing once they get in there? All right, do you have anything in place to detect or to stop or deter these types of attacks? So it makes it really easy. And I think a lot of our space is moving to understanding the actual threats for your organization and gearing your security to those specific threats. And they're usually done by like industry, or maybe there's someone that's specifically targeting you for whatever reason.
Yeah, no comment on the threat intel.
On Intel, yeah. So I will say, I'm gonna put this out there. I would love to have someone. Actually, I talked to a buddy who's in threat intel, and I said, "Yo, man, I would love for you to come on the podcast and tell us how threat intel is useful." I'm just kidding. Well, kind of. But for us, technical people, threat intel isn't that great because it doesn't give us enough details to either emulate the threat or find them in the environment. But for the information at a high level for executives, it's actually pretty handy. Like, okay, who's targeting us, whatever. It may help them understand how much money, how much, figure out their budget or whatever in terms of risk analysis type stuff. But there are some really, really, really good threat intel people. Actually, you met one of them. You met her last year. She's amazing at it. I think she's over at Google now. But there are some really, really great people. Nate's really good. He's the guy I hope to have on here and tell us about Intel and why it's awesome. and tell us what good people are actually doing with it. But yeah, it's hit or miss. They're not all built the same. And I guess that's pretty much every job though. Not every pen tester isn't the same. Every EDR is not the same. So it is what it is. But I will say I have very rarely have I met someone that just blows me away in threat intel.
Yeah. I think it also gets potentially relied on too much, right? Like it's intel because it's known. So if you're only sticking to what is publicly reported, or even if you have closed intel sources, such as a paid for intelligence provider, right? Or intelligence feed, it's still been observed. It's likely been reported because these companies who find these attacks want to make more money, get more customers, right? So they're going to expose these things. It makes them look good, gets them more revenue. And then there are also people, vendors, or larger organizations that will monitor and might not report, right? Because they're reporting to government agencies or whatever it might be on other nation state actors that they're able to track. So long story short, like you said, yeah, threat intel, don't have the best experience with them. And I like the IC, the intel community when I was in the military, like working with NSA people. But outside, working with NSA people has been interesting because even that, like you hear NSA, National Security Agency of the United States, right? Just because you work there.
Agency.
What?
Is that what they were called? No such agency?
Maybe. Just because someone worked there, though, does not mean that they are necessarily top tier. And that kind of blew me away. I did work for one guy, also at a previous organization, who ran a research facility for them, may or may not have. And like that dude was one of the most brilliant people I've met, which I would hope, right? Like he was running a research facility for that level of an organization. And then we've met other people who are like, yeah, I worked there. And it's like, I don't know how you like passed the test. Like, how did you get this job offer?
I've had the same experience actually.
So it varies. But like you said,
yeah,
so is everything else.
Yeah, besides the crap talking here, I will say like a lot of the useful intel are for like the less sophisticated adversaries. They're almost like your street gangs or low-level street gangs. They're going to use the same playbooks. They're going to keep using the same exploit that maybe fixed at like half of the places. They don't care. They're just going in there ransacking and getting what they can get while the getting's good, to use a Southern saying. It just is what it is. But your sophisticated adversaries like that Russian one we were talking about with SolarWinds, as soon as it's identified, they're done. They're moving away from that technique. That you're not going to see it anymore. So there's a big discrepancy between those low-level adversaries and those high-level, really cutting-edge type adversaries.
Yeah, and another thing that I think we should highlight, I'm glad you brought it up, is the people who are just kind of reusing things, right? And the level of sophistication. And I forgot where I was going to go with this. It was on my notes, man. It went away.
Yes. Distracted.
But
I win.
The like the quote unquote like spray and pray, right? So a lot of times there'll be like a POC that gets released. For example, Twitter's a great place, GitHub, to find POCs. And then they'll take that and they'll just send it out as wide as they can, because if they get one person to pay them, right, like they're making money, compared to more sophisticated threat actors, like you said, who are putting time and research and money into the development of their malware or other tools. And so that can really change the barrier of entry right? So if you are implementing patches and such, and a lot of times people, this is where I was going to go with this. Anyways, if you're implementing
Good job.
patches and
Good
such,
recovery.
then you should be putting yourself in a pretty good spot. What I want to say before I went on this tangent is a lot of times the kind of medium, more sophisticated threat actors will reverse engineer a patch. And so just because a patch exists doesn't mean, as we've seen, that everyone has actually installed or correctly implemented that patch. So it's still a viable way if obviously you have to understand and know code and the various languages, but it's still a viable way to be able to gain insight into where a vulnerability might exist and then attempt to exploit it. You can use a scanner like Shodan or a few other tools online to basically see like this many people have this particular application exposed to the internet. So going back to the case of MoveIt, you'd be able to see like MoveIt runs on this port. There's usually like this address and the URI, and then you could scan for that and you could say, all these people are vulnerable. I have this POC. I'm just going to start sending stuff out.
Let me reemphasize the power of tools like Shodan. I think he kind of glossed over why it's so amazing. So Shodan is just constantly scanning the internet for live hosts, and it's identifying what versions of the software are running on those ports. So like a port and service, so like web may be running on port 80 or 443 or 8443. And it's telling you what version of the software is also running on that. And so what they can do is they can quickly say if there's a vulnerability like MoveIt, and it has like a specific thing on the website to let you know that it's running. In Shodan, you can say, give me a list of every website with this thing, with MoveIt on it. And then you can take another tool and automatically just run that SQL injection, which is the attack, against every single one of these, and just have such a high success rate as an attacker. And that's what they do. So for those companies who say, I'm small, no one's going to target me, that's the evidence that that isn't the case. You're a target of opportunity. Just like if you went into a store at night, you left your car locked, but you had a purse or a wallet or $500 sitting on the seat, you're a target of opportunity. Someone's going to smash your window, steal that money, and go. And that's pretty much what that's pretty much what happens in the digital world here. They see you, they're going to attack you, and they're going to take what they can take because you just happen to be there. Right for the picking. Speaking of oldies but goodies, one of my favorite ones is up next, Eternal Blue. And speaking of the NSA.
Now I'm sad. I just looked up MoveIt and I saw port, and there's a port 2222, and the second hit is for a hospital in Rochester.
Oh, you're on Shodan right now?
Yeah.
Would you like to show Shodan?
Sure.
Don't share all your other 50 million tabs.
That's great advice.
Yeah. So he's going to show you Shodan. Did you end up getting the subscription on a Black Friday where it was like forever?
Maybe. I don't know that this is like a paid for a thing.
Yeah. So it used to be you could get a forever license on Black Friday, just FYI. So it's coming up for those of you. Shodan doesn't work as well as it used to. I will say there's a lot of tools that block its scanning capability and won't do the expected response. So it's not as great. But scanning tools like Nmap and MassScan have gotten so much faster. And with the advent of cloud, you can really scan the entire internet pretty quick by yourself these days. So no biggie.
Yeah. So in Shodan, you have a few different capabilities, right? So we're just looking for MoveIt. Again, going back to that example, on the left, you can see the number of results that are showing, the countries that they're in, the top ports, right? So we have 22, typically SSH. 20.
So it's showing actually really small for me right now. I don't know if you can make it any bigger.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you make it any bigger?
No, that's full screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, before it was just like a window. Now it's full screen. Anyways, we got ports. Again, I just saw 2222, so I clicked on it. It'll take you into the results that show that, or you could add a filter such as port : And then you can see the certificates for the SFTP services that are running there. Not really anything too awesome in this
Yeah, it's hard to
example.
see here. I'll do an overlay with an image. I'll see what it looks like in post-production.
Yeah, but there are a ton of things that you could do, right? So we could actually just,
you could look for cameras, like if you want to snoop on people.
oh yeah, IT or IoT
Yep. A
was
lot of IoT
real
just sitting on the
big.
internet. Yeah.
Yeah,
So a lot of times you'll hear us throw the word around internet facing, and this is what it means, where we can directly connect to it from anywhere on the internet. That's internet facing asset.
yeah. Port
Dangerous.
22. There's 26 million that have port 22 exposed to the internet. That doesn't mean that they're insecure, right? That just means that it was able to identify this port was running on this device. And then here under top products, we can see OpenSSH, which is a big SSH provider. We got Dropbear, never heard of. A couple of Linksys, modified things, so on and so forth. And then you can select OS. There's a ton of stuff that you're actually able to drill down on.
Can you click one of them and just show where like it shows the versioning? We'll see if it shows up in post-production, but like maybe on the right over there where there's a banner, where it's doing banner grabbing.
Yep, click on this. All right.
So there's lots of details in here just about the stuff that identify for that particular IP address.
So here it's actually pulling some vulnerabilities that might exist based off of OpenSSH. So that's what I clicked on. We've got a couple from 2023, 2021, et cetera, et cetera. And then if we actually go to look at the SSH, they're running OpenSSH 7.4 is the versioning. So if we look at the vulnerabilities here, it says through 9.6, before 9.6. So assuming that this is a good banner grab, this device is running 7.4, then it is likely that it is susceptible to these vulnerabilities that are up to the 9.6 version.
Yeah, one of the cool things you can do here is like we could probably fine tune the search to find MoveIt. Or I think there's some other similar ones that have been vulnerable lately. Ivanti is one of them. It has a VPN provider on the internet. And we could find all the ones with a specific version that is affected. And that's kind of where the power of this tool comes in handy. We can just systematically find every host, and then we just take another tool to do the actual exploitation. So this is what we call discovery or enumeration. But this is what real bad guys do.
And this is why you should know what you are exposing at your boundary.
Yeah, this is why people get a lot of like vulnerability scans on the external, or like with my company, they'll ask for both an internal and external scan. So they want to know, hey, what can a bad guy get to on the outside? And really there's only, I guess, maybe 3 ways in that we get in most of the time. One is an exploit, which we're talking about on this podcast. Is there something actually vulnerable? 2, we do password guessing. So we use that to get into email services and VPN, so we can get into the internal network if there's not MFA enabled. And then lastly, social engineering is the other big one. Can we send an email and phish someone, or social engineer someone with a text message or whatever? Can we trick them into installing something so we can get access? So really, those are your 3. I don't think I missed any. Did I? Those are the 3 ones that I've used. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I don't think so.
No, sounds good to me.
Supply chain, whatever. But
yeah,
I mean, that's obvious. Well, it's not obvious. SolarWinds is supply chain.
Well, also, like as a pen tester, you're probably not using supply chain.
Yeah, that's super advanced.
I do have an example of finding a vulnerability that was also actively being exploited by Russian threat actors on Shodan at a particular time. I won't go into too much detail, but there were multiple devices that were publicly exposed that I identified that the third-party intelligence providers, or I guess boundary kind of perimeter security people, had not previously identified. And that was really interesting for me because it was my first time finding something like that at a client of mine. And I was like, this is bad. And then reported it and tried to, basically do some validation that it hadn't already been exploited. And they were like, we're not giving you logs. I was like, okay, can't tell you if you've been exploited or not, but if you don't want to give me access, that's on you. I've elevated, and you're now aware, so it's your booty to the fire.
Yeah, you get those random reactions from clients sometimes, like they're curious, but only up to a certain point, and then they just want to bury their head in the sand. And it takes a lot of work to convince them that this is bad. It could be very, very bad if you don't determine with high confidence, right? I will never use the term certainty in cybersecurity, but determine with high confidence that it wasn't successfully exploited. Like it's just to know, anyone listening, you will never hear, I'm saying never, that's a word of certainty, but very few people will speak like in certain terms that things have occurred in cybersecurity. If they do, they're probably noobs, or they just have ample evidence and they can say without a shadow of a doubt. Even in digital forensics, it's a game of, I have a lot of evidence pointing towards this thing, and it's a game of high confidence. It's not a sure thing unless I have a video of this guy or gal doing this thing, and I have the evidence from the system to collaborate what I'm seeing on the film. I'm not certain. I see it, but someone could have planted the evidence. With AI now, someone could have manufactured video. Like at a point, I don't know if it's still the same. You had, and I thought this was hilarious when I read it. I used to read like all kind of random stuff, like all the time, like hacks and POCs all the time. Anyways, the police cameras. So they had a web service exposed, and there was no credentials on it. So you could just log right in, and you could delete any camera footage on it or plant footage or whatever you wanted. So stuff like that. You can't rely on these things that are supposed to be evidence for court. But that's what I mean. There's nothing certain in our space. Things can be planted and tampered with, and you have to really have a lot of evidence to correlate that an activity occurred.
Yeah, I'm really curious what the actual burden of evidence is for the DOJ when we do, I was going to say embargoes, that's not the right word, indictments of like foreign citizens, so like basically when we dox, or I don't know how to explain doxing, releasing the real name of.
You're catching on. Explain these words.
Releasing like the real name and address sometimes of people who are behind handle, like a username on a platform, such as
what's your handle?
I'm not telling
I'm
you.
just kidding.
Not that slow. What's the what's the marketplace for hacks? Like, I'm blanking right now.
Are you talking about like Silk Road or something?
No, not. I said hacks, not drugs.
Fair.
Now we know where Mike goes.
I've never been on the Silk Road, for the record.
No, but like it's the tour service. I'm blanking so hard right now. But like, you can hire hackers, right? You can pay them, or like someone will say, "Hey, pay me $30K. I've got this no-click exploit for Apple iPhones or whatever," right? And occasionally, Department of Justice and probably some other countries will release the name and like sometimes the address. I've seen the address, I think, or regions of where they live, especially ransomware groups, because everyone is like so anti-ransomware group right now. And then they'll just release the real name, give them an indictment. So it's like, if you ever step on like friendly soil, they'll not eradicate, Jesus. Extradite, that's the word. Eradicate, because I'm in my IR mindset. Yeah, I like when that happens.
That's true. It gets a lot of people. Like they'll go on the British people call it a holiday somewhere, and then they just get jacked up and arrested and then sent back.
Yeah, and I don't know if he was an oligarch or just a billionaire or what, but be careful who you take around if you're a wanted person, because if they post the tail number of your helicopter, you might get caught.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing. Someone was posting on Twitter, Elon Musk's his plane, wherever it was going all the time, and he tried so hard to get the guy to stop, and he just wouldn't.
Well, there was a guy who recently was arrested because he had like an Instagram model with him, and she posted the tail number of the helicopter.
I did see that. Yeah.
And someone tracked it.
Watch out for those influencer guys.
Yep.
Those influencers, they'll get you. They got to film everything.
Yep. Sometimes, they'll ruin your life, just like Eternal Blue. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I'll talk about Eternal Blue. I was still using it up to like 2 years ago in organizations. Like I would just get so happy. So when I do pen tests, what I do is I usually do a vulnerability scan. That's not the only thing I do, unlike most people. But I do a vulnerability scan because I call it a comprehensive pen test. So I want to get all these low hanging fruit. And sometimes there's fun stuff like Eternal Blue in there, and I'll go ahead and try to exploit it. But it's good. So you just get like, here's all the stuff while I'm in here. I just let it run, and then I do my thing while it's doing its thing. And I just check on it when it's done, see if there's anything cool. But this was still going on. And what's funny is that there's an amazing exploit and Metasploit for this. So Metasploit is a framework, an attack framework. It's free. It's built into Kali. Kali is a operating system used by a lot of hackers. Some people may be like, oh, it's for noobs. Nah, I'm just lazy. I don't want to install all this crap myself. So I use Kali, but it's in there, and it's really like I type in a few things. I say select Eternal Blue. I type in the name of the target. I type in what type of payload, so what type of connection I want to make to the victim, and that's pretty much it. Hit go, and then I get a connection back. So super simple. And the amazing thing, what I love about Eternal Blue when I see it is I get instant system level access. So a NT authority system, which is above local administrator, own any system with it because of just the way the exploit works. So it's amazing. When I get it, I love it. Absolutely love it. And I was still finding it in places, which is unbelievable. Look up how old this thing is. This show, like, patching is not being done in a lot of places because this, but also sometimes patching while you're looking it up, unless you have it now, sometimes it can't. And one of the companies I had where I found this, they couldn't patch the system because they needed it at that version because the old software they had wouldn't work with anything else. And they were in the process of decommissioning it all the way across the organization. So they had no choice but to leave it in there. And so after I found it, they isolated the system so it wasn't as easily exploited. So substantially reducing the risk that a threat would take advantage of the vulnerability, but it's still there and it's amazing. I mean, it's a instant win in an organization because once you have that, then I can go and get all the passwords off the system, all the password hashes, and start bouncing around, which is what I did in that network too, and then bounce around and take over all the administrator systems and all that. But yeah, how old is it? Did you see?
Well, if you would have clicked on the link that I provided, it was
While I was talking, I was letting you do
disclosed in 2017. So Rapid7 is actually the page that I provided. Who I believe Rapid7 owns Metasploit, right?
Yeah, they bought it.
Yeah.
Or they took over the project. I don't remember if they bought it or took it over.
Yeah, so this is March. If you do Google, it says April of 2017. But I mean, if you found this after 2017, to be honest, that's too late.
Yeah, but it's still, so what did I say, a couple of years ago? So that'll be 2022. So 5 years, I'm still finding it. And this came out of the NSA stuff, the shadow brokers leak. So basically a group of hackers hacked the NSA, grabbed all their tools and dropped it on the internet, called the shadow brokers. So this came out of that, which was awesome. Well, it's not awesome that it happened, but it was awesome that we got to see the tools that the NSA was using. So let me clarify my language there. I'm not supporting hacking the government or any of that, but I do enjoy having a sneak peek at the stuff they're using.
Shadow Brokers was actually on my birthday.
Really?
Yep. I'm trying to make sure.
Now you know Anthony's birthday. Go hack him.
Wow, like you couldn't just Google it.
Yeah, this was a fun one. Yeah, I definitely enjoyed this. And what you'll see, so one of the things we didn't really talk about too with exploits is, so not all exploits are as serious. There's a rating system, and we talked about it, where it's 0 to 10, but the rating system is called a CVSS score. That's what we use in pen testing and vulnerability management. And it's changed. So it used to be 2, version 2 was the big one that everyone used, and then it changed to 3, and I think maybe 4 is out now. And 3 and 4, they started taking into consideration whether there's a public proof of concept out. And so that makes it even more critical in a sense that, sure, it's a critical vulnerability, but without there being a public proof of concept, it's very critical. but not a lot of people know how to take advantage of it. And the level of sophistication required to do so is really high. To be honest, not a lot of people can read a disclosure that something occurred and be able to pick out the details and replicate the attack. That is a very rare skill. And so it's not going to happen a lot. But as soon as someone drops a proof of concept that anyone can run, or just about anyone can run with a very low level of understanding of hacking, then you have a serious problem. Then you have that issue where you have Shodan and just massive systematic attacking of every system on the internet vulnerable to it. So my point is they started introducing the proof of concept being available publicly as one of the things that they consider in their ratings, which I think is fantastic. Before, they didn't really care. They just looked at the criticality of how it impacted the system and the network that it sat on. But now they take other things, which is very cool to see.
And CVSS is what you use to score when you're doing a penetration test?
Yeah, it's pretty much the universal scoring mechanism. We use 3 when we can, because 4 is still, I think it's still kind of in beta, but not everything has a 3. So you'll still see like Eternal Blue probably only has a CVSS version 2 score. So you'll see a mix of version 2 and 3 on our reports when I do a pen test.
Yeah, I know a lot of times CVSS will be used for one side of cybersecurity, for example, but the risk score might be determined by a different model. And then, you've got, before you're done, you've got 3 or 4 different models that are actually being used to try to determine what is best to follow.
Yeah, it's tough. And since you mentioned risk, just because this vulnerability is rated at a 10 doesn't mean your risk is a 10. Risk means something different. If the system it's on isn't connected to anything, your risk is pretty minimal. So like, for instance, if someone hacked my company's website and they took control of it, I don't really care. I'll just reset it. I don't have any client information in it. I don't really care. The impact is very minimal. It's not like they're getting access to my pen test reports, so who cares? So that's what we mean by risk. Is it really going to affect operations? Is it going to affect the sensitive data? Yes or no? That's going to determine the risk. Or also, is there a chance that from that attack, they can migrate and pivot into other very sensitive systems? So taking into consideration what could possibly be affected to understand the true risk of that particular vulnerability. And to kind of point out, in pen testing, we try to understand that, but we don't have that intimate knowledge of your organization. So it's really hard. I did one recently where they told me like privacy is a really big thing. Okay, now I can judge the risk of everything in terms of privacy and what you're trying to protect. But if you didn't tell me that, I'm just going to look at everything as normal, like a normal risk for an organization. So it's important to talk about that when you're scoping your pen test or understanding the scope of your vulnerability management program. Convey it to your vendors so they can help you with understanding the risk.
Yeah, and alternatively too, if you're on the receiving end of a penetration test report, right? Because you have that in-depth knowledge of your network, or at least have like your IT, your sysadmin in there at the same time, they might be able to push back on the criticality because there's a compensating control, or maybe something that was potentially identified but not actually pushed to due to constraints or rules of engagement, right? So say you found a page, for example, that was behind a password, and so in order to view the page, you had to supply the correct password. Then you could assume, oh, well, this could be easily guessable, for example. But then if I know what the password is, and it's a 20-character long password that is all characters, letters, and symbols, I'd be like, no, it's a pretty good password, dude. I don't think you're getting into it. So there's, just because something is identified, right, doesn't mean that that's like what it actually is. It needs to be contextualized for each environment and each customer with the context of knowing what is deployed, what is actually accessible behind that system, and so on.
Yeah, contextualize is the big key word there. I think that's a lot of cybersecurity, is contextualize it. Does this make sense for your organization? And only you know that. If you're like a CISO or you're in charge of your program, only you're going to be able to tell, is this relevant? Do I care? Do I want to spend money on this thing? Because we all know there's not an unlimited budget. So use what you give a crap about to help figure out where your money is going, essentially.
Yep, absolutely right. All right. Next up, we have Print Nightmare, which is a fun one. I like this one. So this was
I
identified
still use it.
in 2021, and the basic gist of it is if you've authenticated to, is it the device or just the network?
So there's variations. You can utilize it to get a foothold, but you can also use it as a priv-esque. I typically use it as a privilege escalation technique now because a lot of the places have shut down the initial foothold approach.
I think when I tested this, so we just did it against like our EC2. But yeah, we did the priv-esque. So basically, priv-esque, privilege escalation, it had to do with the ability to add a printer, and then basically you were the system admin on that box. And if you did it on like a domain controller, for example, then congratulations, you can now become domain admin.
Yeah, that's where a lot of people were seeing it. Hopping on the domain controllers, but I don't know that I've actually used the initial foothold. If I've used that, maybe. I use zero logon. That was another one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I still use the priv-esque technique. It's widespread still. And it's a vulnerability, and there's an exploit for it. But it's not like a true vulnerability. I don't think Microsoft plans on changing it because it's working the way it was designed. So it's one of those ones. It is a known issue. They're probably not going to change it, and it's going to be up to you as an organization to change configurations to prevent it from being taken advantage of. So there's not a patch for this, for instance, for the privilege. I don't think there is. Let's see. Let me scroll down to the bottom of his link so I don't tell lies here. So there's multiple patches. It says you can patch it, but I still see it, and they're fully patched clients.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Well, remember I want to say the first time they patched it, it didn't actually work. And then that's how the second step was found. But yeah. And then this mentions Papercut. I want to say Papercut had a pretty big vulnerability also.
Printers are built like crap. I'm gonna just put that out there. I'm sure everyone has a print nightmare story where they can't get the printer to work. Not that they're using the exploit, but yeah. Well, and they are crap. There's a lot of cool stuff. Like I actually have some cool techniques I use for printers every time to enumerate, and I'll try to do relay credentials with it and stuff. Like there's some fun tricks. I've only gotten to work a couple times, but I always try it because a lot of people have default username and password set, and then I can get a list of usernames and then start password guessing. And sometimes they save a set of credentials for a network share, and then I modify that share to point to my system, and then I like relay or get that or try to crack the hash. Like there's a bunch of fun stuff you can do with printers. So I love seeing printers on networks. So it's not just this one. I mean, those attacks have nothing to do with this one, but I do love it as a privilege escalation technique. It's definitely, it's in my bag of tricks as a pretty usual technique I will use on probably half of my engagements. Yeah, that's because it's so easy. The only thing you have to worry about is I have a custom exploit. So I'm using the same basics of it, but I've modified it enough so that AV doesn't stop it, essentially. So I can run it on there. And that's the thing, like you were talking about well-signatured. Yeah, if you use the proof of concept on the internet, it's well-signatured. So you do need to make your own and modify it, and you're golden. You'll get the priv-esque out.
Yeah, and going back to things you can do with printers, right? There was an example. I still don't know what actually happened, but there was a ransomware infection that I know of, and the only thing they could tell us when we initially had talks to them was they got in through the printers, and we're like, what does that mean? Like, how do you, first off, what does that mean? Second off, how do you know? Because it doesn't look like you're giving us any logs. So like, what do you mean they got in through the printers? Like, did they print a message that says, hello, we are here, So that
used to be funny, like vulnerability scanners would trigger like now an SSU like actually have to deliberately check scan printers, but they'll print out messages to people, and it was freaking out companies. So you had to stop doing that. I never did that for the record, but people have. I've heard they're like, you're not going to print out anything stupid, are you? No. I have that turned off.
Well, that's like, I was running my headphones one time, and the person who trolls me a lot decided to run one of the like speak actions against my box, and it turned the volume all the way up, and it scared the shit out of me because it also like used my name. So it was like, for example, it'd be like AJ is dumb or something, right? But I'm just sitting here
Yeah.
listening to YouTube, doing my thing, and then all of a sudden it
And
goes
it
all
just
quiet.
blasts your eardrums.
Yeah, well, first it goes all quiet, right? Because it like stopped the YouTube, and I was like, "What's going on?" And then yeah, AJ's dumb. I was like, "Oh gosh!" But another
Yeah.
thing, I think you actually showed me this, which was really interesting, was uh, basically once you gained access to the printer, I don't know if it was like the print spool or whatever, but you could collect what was being sent to the printer.
Oh yeah, I did show you that. Yeah. There's cool stuff. So like you can recover documents depending on the printer. It's like old ones though. None of the new ones do it. But theoretically, there are exploits where you can dump the RAM and recover some of the memory. The files won't be perfect. I mean, I think in that case we were actually collecting the file, the print job itself. But yeah, there's fun stuff. I don't typically go that route. Simply, like I may do it as a proof of concept, but it doesn't help me escalate my access during a pen test. So I don't go that route. So like we've talked before, like I really focus on stuff that's going to escalate my access and help me achieve my goal. So a lot of stuff I just ignore, or I'll document real quick and then move on. I don't fully explore it because it's not helping me do what I'm supposed to be doing, what I was hired to do. But yeah, printers have a lot of good stuff. Like I said, you can get the usernames, you could perhaps steal some credentials out of there. You could get a list of all the jobs. In that case, we actually saw the job. So and there was sensitive financial information like bank account numbers and stuff like that in there, customer information, account information, and all that. So that was a treasure trove. It didn't help escalate the attack once again, but it did show impact in that we saw stuff we shouldn't have been seeing. Yeah, and that was default credentials too, if I remember correctly. So it is legitimately, I've never been in an organization where they had every printer with non-default credentials. There's always at least a handful that had default credentials I could just log right into and play with.
It's wild.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, but it happens.
Let's move on to your LLMNR poisoning and have fun explaining that acronym.
Yeah, I forget what it means, but basically, this is one of my go-to strategies as well in an organization if I do a rogue device. So, rogue device is where we call it an assumed breach. So, think about the scenario where someone can walk into your organization, plug in a laptop. What can they do at that point? Believe it or not, a lot of places have free Wi-Fi that's not segmented, or they have network jacks just laying around. You can plug right in the lobby. It's very common. It's less common now, but it is pretty common. So we'll do it. We'll start that way. And essentially what I can do is I can put up a poisoner. And so what that means, force people's traffic, their network traffic, to come to me. And in that, I can trick them into trying to resolve host names. So you have an IP address we talked about before. You also have the host name. Host name is like the human version of your computer's designation. And so I can force them to go to me to get that information. And with that, I can collect the credentials that they're sending across all these other devices on the network. So it's an oldie but goodie. I've been using this technique for, I don't know, probably 5, 6, 7 years, however long it's been around. Well, pretty much since it's been around, but it works almost every time I get something. And then I just crack the passwords with it. This is kind of this is a vulnerability. I was going to say, no, it's a vulnerability. It's a finding for sure. But you can turn it off. So that's a good thing. If you have this going on in your environment, turn it off, or I'll use it if you hire me.
Yep.
Yeah, it's such an easy way to get your initial foothold in an organization. I love it.
Yeah, and just to clarify, LLMNR is the successor to NetBIOS. So it is, I don't know, is that the latest thing? It says there's MBTNS as well, but or NetBIOS over TCP/IP. But yeah, this is good. You don't even have to do like a DAuth attack or a deauthentication attack to kick someone off of the internet in order to have them re-authenticate to you. You basically just
old
say,
school Wi-Fi stuff is what you're talking about.
Yeah. You just say like, hey, I know how to find this place, and then they send you the request and you get their hash, which is also, like you mentioned file servers before, like a lot of places set up file servers that are automatically mapped, right? So if you impersonate that file server, then you'll probably get some hashes.
Yeah, well, one of the tricks you can do, my dad was actually just doing this in the lab because I've showed him before. He's never done it, but it's doing a relay, and you can do it with a responder where you have the ability, like say you could do internal phishing. You had an internal email and you send him a link to go to your file server, like you just stand one up and you have a responder running, which is the tool. One of the common tools, there's like two big ones, but this is Responder is one of the one that you would use on Linux, and you have that running. And so when they click that link, that's all they have to do is click the link. It sends your net NTLM credentials, so they're like a hashed version of your credentials to my system where Responder is running, and then I could take that to my password system that does. I think last time I ran it, I was doing 8 billion password guesses a second. So I could, as long if it's not a crazy password, a pretty normal password, I could guess it pretty quick.
Nuts. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to say there was another, so it was similar, but it was a Microsoft vulnerability. Well, this is also Microsoft, obviously, being on Windows OS, but you like send, I don't think it was, maybe it was the same thing, like sending the link. I thought it was like you could share to someone, and so like they didn't have to click the link, but when you shared it, it would kind of like kick something off on their end that would try to like validate that they had access.
Yeah. I forget what it's called. You can just add a file and goof with the way you place the file on the share. And then all they have to do is just go to the folder where that file is and it will trigger the attack. Can't remember what it's called. I know what you're talking about. I think they might have fixed that. I've never actually used it. I tried it and tested it when it first came out and it worked. And then I never had an opportunity to use it. So like what's funny is in pen testing, like I know a bunch of these techniques. I have a handful that are just oldies but goodies. Like I know they still work, but so many of them get fixed so quick. I don't really worry about like trying them out. So I don't care about the ones that they're just going to patch. So if I'm doing incident response or something, I will, especially if a client's affected by it. But from an attacker's perspective, I don't really care because I'm not one of those people that go out and just scan and then attack all these people. I don't do that. I only attack if I get paid. So, and have permission. So yeah, so like I just focus on the ones that I think are going to stick around and have, like we already talked, the print spooler. I mean, that's an oldie but goodie. Anything with the printer's default credentials, password guessing, still an oldie but goodie. LLMNR. These are all great ones I just leverage as often as possible because they just work. They're classics.
Yeah. If Microsoft deems something a feature, it's staying around, man.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another cool one that I used for a little bit where you could use Defender, which is Microsoft's built-in antivirus, and you could use it to download files. So you could download malware and it would just okay it because it was Defender doing it, But they ended up fixing that so you couldn't leverage it to do that anymore. But that's like I think that lasted maybe a few weeks. It didn't last very long.
Testing that one too.
Sad times. That's another good one that I've been using. I have like this whole exploit change. JScript to C# or something like that. I use that sometimes to hide my payloads and it works magically.
What were you using where you had a few things chained together?
That's what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Let me look at my notes. I'll tell you. But yeah, that thing works amazing. It's starting to get detected now and you have to take some more steps to modify it. But that was something they did teach. But it does work in the real world. I used it on an engagement while I was studying for that, and it worked. So,
Nice.
I was like, cool. I actually got to use something from a course I was taking.
Yeah, that's always fun.
.NET to JScript. So that was part of the attack, and then I turned that into MSHTA. So it was like quite a bit of chains, and then of course I encrypted the actual payload itself. So there's it took about 20 minutes to prep the attack in order to get it to work. But once you did, it would launch. There was actually a chain of several different techniques to get it to work properly.
Yeah, I used, back when I was first on Cactus Torch, was really good at getting stuff to launch, which is JavaScript and VBScript shellcode. So it would just change. I think it just encodes it and then injects shellcode.
Bad part for us, as if we're doing anything offensive, is anything that becomes a tool. If we have access to it, the defenders have access to it. So they will start signaturing it like Veil. used to be a really good one to hide PowerShell. That went away pretty quick. There's like another obfuscation tool that came about after for PowerShell. There's invoke obfuscation or something like that, maybe, and that doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
AMSI is like a kind of part of Defender, but not really, that scans memory for code and scripts that are executing, and there are bypasses for it, and there's a lot of public ones, but every time someone makes one public, they add it to Defender, so it detects that you're attempting to bypass AMSI's ability to scan. So it's really a cat and mouse game, 100%. So it's pretty annoying. So that's why if I make something, I don't make it public for a lot of cases, especially if I want to use it long term.
And explain to the listeners what AMSI stands for.
Do you have it up? Because I don't know what it stands for.
Come on, man. Anti-malware scan interface.
Oh, man. I was set up for failure on that one.
You should have known.
No. Yeah, I mean, I play with it a lot. It's one of those layers of defenses on your system. So whenever we look at antivirus, how it works, it's running at different layers. So you have one component that scans it when it's like placed on disk, like you just dropped a file, it'll scan it usually. And then as soon as you click it and run it, there's a lot of things that happen to it. And one of them is AMSI looking in memory as it's running to see if anything's going on. And then that could trigger a detection. And the antivirus also, it's called hooking, but basically they're watching what types of functionality are running to see if there's anything suspicious that's being executed, any suspicious functionality, and then it'll trigger and stop the process if it finds it. Yeah, so that's what AMSI does. It's part of that workflow for antivirus. And what's great about it, it's not just Defender. Actually, most antiviruses use it as well. They tap into it and get the telemetry from it.
All right. Next, we have another large vulnerability. I don't think either of us worked on this. Or I feel like I worked on this in some capacity. Log4Shell.
You are getting more than you bargained for today on this podcast. We are telling you all the stuff.
Just not how to exploit it.
Yeah.
All right. 2021, yet again.
Next time on C-Suite Cyber, we attack the world.
Watch us hack the Pentagon. Just kidding. Yeah. So Log4Shell, also 10 out of 10. It is actually exploiting a Java library and Apache, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so Java naming and directory interface, JNDI, injection vulnerability, which allowed RCE, which we discussed earlier, is remote code execution. So kind of similar to MoveIt in that there's an injection and then you're able to execute arbitrary code and you can execute in the same level of access that the application was running in. So essentially, if it's running as system or admin, then you are instantly placed into that level of shell. This one was big. I don't actually see numbers on this link as far as how many businesses and organizations were impacted, but I remember this was like a worldwide issue, very similar to, Apache Struts was one of the products that was affected by this.
I was trying to see if this was in fact the one that was found on
Minecraft,
but it says it was found by this guy from Alibaba.
Did he write Minecraft?
There was some exploit I was talking about earlier before we started recording. The guy targeted the chat feature in Minecraft and found it, and then it just became this like massive vulnerability that was so widespread. It was insane.
Yeah, so to give you an example of some of the organizations that were impacted, and I'm getting
Minecraft was vulnerable to it, though.
Okay. I mean, maybe he was just playing Minecraft. But we've got big names, right? We've got Apple, Tencent, Twitter, Baidu, Steam, Minecraft, Cloudflare, Amazon, Tesla, Palo Alto, yada yada, Google, Ghidra. That's interesting to know that was a company name.
You said Ghidra?
Yeah, they're listed. Must not be. Yeah, the Ghidra that we know is very different.
Yes, NSA's malware analysis tool. Yeah, reverse engineering.
Yep. So a lot of big organizations were impacted by this. I'm sure there were government organizations as well. Adobe is pretty highly used. So this was another one. And I don't remember who's actually behind this attack.
Yeah, so this one was like a weird one too, where you couldn't, especially like early on, you couldn't just scan and identify that a specific software was vulnerable because it used a library. You would have had to have the scanner actually scan files on the host instead of just like a service scan the files on the host and look for the vulnerable library. So there was something, it was like a dependency used by this program that was affected. And that is what caused the big vulnerability wherever it was utilized by the larger application became kind of like the entry point for actually accessing it and exploiting it.
So I just read that this was actually the vulnerability existed since 2013, but Log4 Shell obviously was exploited in 2021. So it's quite possible that other government organizations had used this covertly to compromise organizations.
Very possible. I mean, that's what happens too. Like the U.S. says they I think it's something like they won't keep it for longer than a year before they let people know. But I mean, they've already been proven wrong on that multiple cases since they stated that. Um, I mean, they're just like me. If it's an oldie and a goodie, no one's detecting it, it's not been seen yet, they're going to keep using it. They pay too much money and invest too much in these things for them to just burn it and to let the world know that this is a thing. So, and every country does that, by the way. It's not just the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. So this is interesting. This actually says, as of December 2023, Veracode found 38% of applications still used vulnerable versions of Log4j, which also remains one of the most attempted outbound and inbound vulnerability exploitations as of 2024.
Yeah, the problem with dependencies when they're affected is that for a programmer, when you update, there could be what we call code breaking changes in the update, which means you're about to completely screw up your application you're working on, and it's going to cost you a lot of time to fix the waterfall of effects that you have by updating it. And so what I mean by like changing it, so it typically with the dependencies, you interact with them in a special way when you're writing code. And with some updates, the code breaking updates, you change the way you actually interact with it. So if you look at the code where the dependency is actually used, you'll see that it's not working the same. And you have to go through and find every interaction with it and modify that code to ensure that it's still doing what it needs to do. And a lot of times these dependencies are used all over the place. So it's not like it's all contained in one small section. It's typically all over the code. You could be talking about thousands or tens of thousands of lines of code that may utilize that dependency. So it takes time to fix. And so what you see with organizations is they're like, okay, yes, I know it's vulnerable, but we're trying to roll out features here. We don't really care about this vulnerability. And so they're going to target operations and features versus patching vulnerabilities. And that's what happens in the world.
Yeah, so I actually pulled up a different article. This is by Avertium, and I'm going to read this little clip here. So there was a ransomware group called Khonsari, Khonsari. They were the first group to attempt to exploit Log4Shell, but Conti ransomware group was actually the first to weaponize it. And they say Log4Shell was initially seen being exploited on Minecraft, which is where the Khonsari group was locking the servers, and their ransomware that they deployed against Minecraft servers apparently did not have any way to contact them, which is pretty good. But I mean, this thing was used by Russian threat actors at the foreign intelligence agencies. We've got Chinese, Iranian, North Korea, several ransomware groups like Dridex is in here, Alpha, Black Cat, who we're familiar with, just about anyone and everyone who could find some reason to exploit it. Looks like they attempted it.
Yeah, it was a good one. So I guess I didn't remember wrong. Minecraft was somewhere in that story. I mean, there's a lot of money there. Like that's one of the conversations you have with owners as well, or executives. You know, what are they going to steal when they get in here? Well, what do you do? Okay, I bet I can give you a scenario to make you sweat. I promise.
Yep. So I think this is also good to add here. Mike, you previously discussed the sophistication levels of threat actors, right? And we mentioned typically it's all going to follow the same playbook, right? Gain access, attempt to elevate, lateral movement, exfil, or whatever your objectives are, kind of thing. So Conti typically leverages a Fortinet vulnerability, which there's several. When this was written, it was 2018. They also use Print Nightmare, which we discussed for PrivEsc or privilege escalation, as well as Zero Logon, which you also discussed for local PrivEsc and lateral movement. And 2 days after Log4Shell was documented, Conti had started to weaponize it. So that attack path would be Emotet, which would deliver Cobalt Strike infection, which would then result in hands-on keyboard or human exploitation is how they document it in this article. And then they would Kerberos and get into ESXi servers with Log4Shell and scan for vCenter. So I thought it was interesting. Several of the things that we've discussed as well as just highlighted in passing, this specific threat actor, Conti, has used, and it just goes to show that once it's out there, right, it's a viable option for threat actors of all levels. Just depends how well they're able to actually implement it.
Yeah, people aren't ashamed to use stuff like this. And I was telling AJ too, this was one of the ones where it wasn't like the basic exploit was the same, but the way every application utilized the library that was affected by this was different. And so it did take some higher level skill set to figure out where that problem was in an application and where to utilize that actual exploit. So it wasn't all cookie cutter. So that was one of the interesting things here. But once you developed a proof of concept for that particular application, you're good to go. It just took some development time because, like you said, it was so widespread, so many applications utilized it, but every application had to have its own individual POC. Where traditionally, we think about a proof of concept, it works everywhere. But things like this that affect like a specific library or dependency, you got to customize it for every application. So it's pretty interesting, something to talk to anyways. So I figured I'd bring that up.
Yeah. So last up, but definitely not least, we have ProxyShell, which is also, next time we need to find some vulnerabilities that aren't all Microsoft related.
I love Microsoft, unlike most people. So like I will say to anyone, Microsoft is my specialty. Like I have books, like I learned forensics, I learned how all the subsystems work. I love Microsoft Windows products specifically, but yeah, all these happen to be Windows, and AJ doesn't have the same enthusiasm as me.
No, well, I mean, we've got a few like applications, SolarWinds, MoveIt, Log4Shell, but I mean, yeah, a lot of these are Microsoft, and again, my own belief, think Microsoft has a lot of dumb practices that they use as far as just how they add stuff to different services, like Exchange, for example. Exchange has been riddled with vulnerabilities, and some of them don't make sense. Like adding the ability to have a remote file be used as your notification. So I can just have my malware send you an invite, or send you an invite with my malware file as the notification sound, which when the meeting invite comes due, you run my malware file. Like, that is stupid. That should not be a thing. But I digress. So
everyone does it though. I just want to point that out. Everyone does stupid stuff. It's not just Microsoft. I got to defend. Everyone, if you want to sponsor Microsoft, we'll take it.
Yeah, we'll talk real nice too for a week. But ProxyShell is actually a combination of 3 different vulnerabilities, which I think is interesting. So all these are going to affect the Exchange application, right? So their email application. So we've got server-side request for forgery, which they're able to chain with PowerShell backend, which gave them the elevation of privilege. So they're able to request something on the server, which gave them access to /PowerShell, where they're able to run code. And then from there, they're able to basically create a new mailbox, which, what do they do after that? They could add a web shell. That's what it was. And then from there, they just access the web shell in order to run code against the server. This is also built into Metasploit. It's also from 2021. 2021 was not a good year for them. And also, I mean, like we said, you've got people who have a ton of money and resources going into finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them and such. So it's going to be found eventually. Stuff will come to light. But this was real interesting. Like web shells, I think that they're interesting. Like, I like the concept of a web shell, right? So if you have something that's exposed to the internet and I'm able to add a web shell, I basically browse to a URL and then I can issue commands to your server from that URL page or from that page on your server. So if you think about it, if you have a web server, typically it's like www root, right? And that's where you have your internet files stored. I don't know why my mic is making a face. Is it not www root?
I mean, you store your shell wherever you can access it. That's the problem with a lot of web exploits. Is a lot of times when you get a file uploaded, you don't know where it's going to be. So it's figuring out where your file gets stored and accessing it is the problem. But sure, that the web root, what he's talking about is like you have the traditional like root of your operating system. Web root is the root of the web application itself.
Yeah, I'm talking about where they're like on the server side, where typically your files would be stored, and then in Microsoft, you would typically use IIS to expose it to the internet and all that jazz. Anyways,
He's using fancy terms and no one knows what he's talking about.
I don't know what IIS stands for, to be completely fair.
Internet of Things.
Yeah, it's Microsoft's
IoT.
web server service is what it is. But yes, so in this example, in the Metasploit, the URL that the web shell is uploaded to is specific, right? So you know where to look for it. And like I said, then you just browse to the URL in your browser and you're issuing commands. So you don't actually have to have like a SSH connection or some other connection. Now, once you've gained a web shell, you would probably want some other type of connection to maintain persistence and get out of the browser.
One of my favorite pastimes is watching someone that's new to hacking get their first web shell and then try to figure out what to do next, because they say a lot of swear words because it doesn't work the way they expect it to work and stuff keeps dropping, and it's a very painful experience. So Casey said one of the first things you want to do is move on over to another type of shell because that one will frustrate you to no end.
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't have much else to say about this.
Well, just to add to web shell, web shells are great for persistence. You'll see that a lot in malware campaigns or just breaches in general, and they're often missed by a lot of people. I remember working one, and I had to argue with the web admins because they were not listening. I won't go into details of what happened, but there's web shells, and they pulled stuff, and they didn't think they could get back in because they like reset credentials or something stupid. But yeah, they missed the web shells. But yeah, they're great for persistence. You'll see that a lot of times. I want to say that's what happened early on with SolarWinds Orion. There was a lot of web shells that got put out as well, and that's how they were maintaining persistence in the environment. So in the attack methodology or the attack chain, you have this concept of persistence, and basically it's a way to get back into an environment if you get kicked out. And so the adversary is usually going to seek some form of persistence, and it's usually like a web shell is a really good way to do it, or they'll install some piece of malware that gets kicked off whenever the system restarts. But the key is they want to get that access right back into that environment no matter what. So even if you do all this cleanup, you miss that one thing or maybe the two things they have in there, they're getting right back in, and you're starting right back over. So that's one of my good arguments. People will try to save money with incident response or whatever. If you don't do it right, you're going to do it all over again. You just wasted all that money because you just messed up and you just missed something.
Yeah. And web shells, I would say, like, if you're just looking at network traffic, you might not see a web shell, right? Because you're just like, man, there's so many pages. Like, you're probably not going to know unless it's titled webshell.asp, like what's actually occurring. So it doesn't surprise me. Now, if you pointed it out and they kind of said, no, that's not a web shell, that would be different. But they are good. Yeah. I could see a lot of people actually missing the identification of something just based off of one set of logs compared to the overall activity that is occurring on the device.
Yeah, well, people also miss the successful web exploits. I mean, think about it yourself. It is very hard to see a successful exploit And it's like, oh, but I can see the attacks, especially through a web application firewall. Yeah. But if you look, I mean, there's thousands of attacks every day against anything sitting on the internet. How do you differentiate between those that fail and those that are successful? Because the problem is that you don't necessarily know how the successful attack is going to present itself in the logs unless you're super familiar with that attack. And most people aren't. So it is like web stuff is tough. It's very tough. And a lot of organizations actually don't get all the web application logs where they can view them, because that's what you need to be able to determine. You need the logs from the server, you need the logs from the web application, and you need the WAF logs so you can see the attacks coming in as well. So you need all that perspective to be able to identify when something bad is actually successful, because there's a big difference there. Like most people don't realize this, and I just mentioned it, but if you put anything on the internet, you are just getting barraged with attacks nonstop, instantly, almost instantaneously as soon as you put something on the internet. So that's why a lot of people don't really pay attention to the logs of their systems that are facing the internet, because it's just so noisy. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands of logs every day, maybe more, depending on, like, I'm sure like Amazon or whatever has millions and millions of people trying to target them. But it's just difficult. It's very difficult unless you have a good team in place to be able to suss through all that stuff and figure out what's important to look at.
Yeah. I actually created I don't remember if it was Microsoft. I think it was Microsoft account. And within 5 minutes, I had a attempted login. Like, no lie, 5-10 minutes. Someone had tried to log into my brand new account. And I mean, it's possible, like, based off of the name, right, that someone would guess it. But that was pretty interesting to see.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the internet's a dangerous place.
Yep. It's also a great place. You can order stuff and it just gets delivered to your house. I mean, you can watch
Uber
things.
Eats.
It's great.
But you can't do that. You have to watch what you eat.
I get clothing and stuff delivered.
Oh.
Back to business, Mike. One thing that we didn't really cover is after patching, you should rescan to make sure that the assets that you patched are no longer showing up as vulnerable. Sometimes, stuff just doesn't install correctly. And so don't just take, well, I ran this or I pushed this patch out, so our numbers should be 0 vulnerable systems. It might not be. So be sure you rescan, especially if there's a new QID for Qualys. I don't know what it's actually called, like a new way to detect where the vulnerability is, because it might be higher fidelity. It might give you a more accurate number compared to what was previously ran.
I'll give a story about why you should rescan and test. So the 0 login one, I actually used it only once in an engagement, and it had the proof of concept had just came out, and I did it on a company. So I was working with the MSSP. They asked us to come in and test their client, and I go in there, and I was like, this just came out. Maybe I'll get an exploit, that hopeful thing where I get to play with something new. And I looked, I was like, oh, it's the version. Let's see if it'll work. Boom, it worked. So it's successful. I was able to get pretty much domain administrator almost within the first 30 minutes of being in the environment, maybe an hour. I do a lot of like enumeration early on, but that's not the important part. Yes, I exploited, but the important part is when I talked to the MSSP, which they sat in during the debriefing. So for those of you who haven't been in a pen test, usually after the test, you send out your report, but you also have a debriefing where you talk about the findings in the report, and you kind of mastermind the report and kick ideas around and figure out the best way to fix stuff. Usually your IT people are in there. Whoever is involved in fixing or the security of your organization or just IT in general, they should be in there so that you can figure out the best way to fix stuff or help identify problems. So they're like, oh yeah, I didn't know that was a thing. Yeah, we probably should fix that across the board here or whatever. But in this case, they had just patched every single one of their clients as soon as the patch had come out for 0 logon, and they didn't realize that the patch did not work correctly. So there's an error with the patching process. It rolled back to the previous version, which means they were still vulnerable. And they didn't realize that because their patch management process was messed up. They obviously went back and put checks in place to ensure they're notified if the patch rolls back. But I was able to attack it because there was a problem in the patch management process, and I took advantage of that as a good bad guy. As they say, shit happens. Yeah. But those are the good people to work with that, like, okay, this is a systemic problem. I need to fix it all the way across the board so that all of our clients are protected. That's why I loved working with them. They did good. They did good stuff. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. I'll stop interrupting. It's time to wrap up, I think is what he's trying to say. He's ready to go to bed. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap, we've gone over several vulnerabilities, patch management cycle, and stuff like that. But regardless of the size of company that you are, you need to have some level of patch management in place in order to protect your organization. Because if not, then you're going to show up on Shodan or these other scanners as vulnerable, and people will take advantage of you regardless of your size and your revenue numbers or how many people you actually give jobs to. So if you need help with that, feel free to reach out to us. We know people. We have knowledge as far as like how to do these things. We won't do it for you, but well, maybe we will. But we can definitely help.
Everyone has their price.
Yeah, exactly. And just to wrap up, like I believe Mike said earlier, right? Shit happens. Vulnerabilities are going to be found. They're going to be exploited. The main thing is not that you never get exploited. The main thing is that you have a plan in place to identify and respond, and then get back to business operations as usual, and keep sure that you have the knowledge of what software is installed, what assets you have. Makes it a lot easier to detect rogue devices like Mike poisoning your LLMNR. And what else, Mike? What else did we cover?
Yeah, I mean that was pretty much it. I mean, remember it's a ongoing process patching. You're not going to do it. Some people are like, oh, I'm gonna just do it once and I'm good. No, you need a program. It is something you're going to be doing consistently because bad guys are finding exploits and vulnerabilities all the time, every day. I mean, was it, what year? 2019, 2021, whatever year it was, there was a ton of criticals. And there's been quite a few this year. So you need to stay on top of it. You need to stay patching. You need to get your stuff tested. It's not going to prevent a breach from occurring, but it's going to make it less probable and less frequent and less damaging as well if you have a good cybersecurity program in place.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. I think that's it for us. That's episode 3 in the books. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.